Welcome everybody. This is volume 2 of the new Master Planning Unplugged webinar series. Like I already mentioned, we also have a blog series that kind of prefaces this, where we'll post blogs about the topics, explaining them in detail, and then we'll use these webinars to kind of walk you guys through some real life examples and hopefully get some feedback and go back and forth with any questions you have. So today's topic is coverage planning. Before I introduce myself, just a little background on eBECS. We are a Microsoft Gold partner in business intelligence, ERP, which would be Microsoft Dynamics AX, and NAV, and also CRM. So we have full-fledged practices for all sides of that, and we're a total Microsoft Business Solutions provider globally. So many of you might be familiar with us in the UK, where we've been previously Reseller of the Year in the UK, I think 5 out of the last 6 years. We're actually Microsoft Partner of the Year in the United Kingdom for this past year. We've won a Global Partner of the Year for 2013. We're part of Microsoft Dynamics Inner Circle, which is something we're really proud of because that's really only the top 1 or 2% of all partners worldwide. And we're also certified in discrete manufacturing and professional services. So professional services, we do managed services as well, both in the private and public clouds and Azure hosted environments. Office 365, field service, and mobile solutions. So we're not just a one-stop shop, we're not just a one-trick shop. We're kind of hopefully a one-stop shop for all of your Dynamics needs and all of your Microsoft needs, whether it be any part of the Microsoft stack. We're really here to kind of help you guys through those transitions, but obviously with a big focus on ERP. So an introduction to myself, if you guys haven't come to one of my webinars before, don't know much about me. My name is Andrew Lensack. I'm a senior application consultant for eBECS North America. I've been with eBECS for a little under 2 years, about maybe 1.5 years to 1 year and 3/4. Before that, I worked for a previous Microsoft partner, and prior to that, I was actually an end user and business analyst in Dynamics 3.0, 4.0, 2009, and 2012. So a lot of experience in various parts of Dynamics AX. I got my start as a production planner and inventory control and doc and data control supervisor for a manufacturing company in the UK who was headquartered in the US, and after I transitioned out of that role, I became an internal business analyst for a manufacturing company that distributed and had offices all over the world, and then about 4 years ago decided to transition into the partner side of things, where I'm helping companies implement and troubleshoot AX. So a quick review of what we covered last time. We talked about the inputs and outputs of master planning. So what is master planning in AX? What type of data is it looking at? Your inputs would be things like your inventory transactions, sales order demand, purchase order supply, production orders, your on-hand inventory, your storage dimensions like site and warehouse, your calendars, whether they be calendars against a warehouse, against a resource, shipping calendars for customers, or receipt calendars for vendors and modes of delivery, and then the hierarchy of your items and item coverage and coverage groups, which we'll talk about today. And the whole goal of master planning is to review that information and generate output, which is your planned purchase orders for supplied items, your planned production orders for manufactured items, and planned transfer orders for items that you're replenishing between warehouses. The main focus on last week's session was static and dynamic plans. So I say here that most companies only have 1 or 2 plans, but you can have as many as needed. So a lot of companies will only either operate a static plan or a static and a dynamic plan and not go much further. One reason why you might have many more master plans is there are a few settings in AX that can only be applied at that level. You can't go more granular than that. One of those, for example, is including on-hand inventory in the master planning calculation. You can only do that at the master plan level, not at the coverage group level or the item coverage level. So if you have certain items that you're always building to demand and you never want on hand to supply that demand, you might be using multiple master plans, so you can separate the items that way. You can copy static plans to dynamic plans, so A lot of companies will refresh the dynamic plan when the static plan runs, so you're starting with a fresh slate, and then as the day progresses, you're seeing the real demand come into the dynamic plan while the static plan stays exactly that, static, because that's your operational plan. That's kind of set in time where you want to obey, the transactions you're placing and not really react right away to new demand, whereas the dynamic plan you can look at and see that new demand and do some simulations or know if you have to expedite orders or push out orders when you actually go and run the static plan. So the next 2 points, I already mentioned dynamic plan. You see the demand in real time. You would use the dynamic plan for things like explosion, if any of you guys are doing capable promise or explosion from the sales order lines. And the real kind of point to drive home with a multiple plan scenario is you have to be diligent. You really have to be thorough and make sure you're updating and reacting to the correct ones. So when you're reviewing screens like your planned orders and your net requirements, you have to filter in the correct plan and make sure you're looking at the right data, because it can be cumbersome if you're not used to that type of situation where you only have one master plan. If you have multiple, you have a lot more stuff to look at, and you have to make sure that you're not entering orders or firming, for example, in the wrong plan, because then you could run into some serious issues. Like I mentioned, the blog for MRP Volume 1 or Master Planning Volume 1 is up on the website, as well as the blog for today's topic as well. So what is today's agenda? We'll do a quick introduction into what we mean by coverage planning and item coverage, and then we'll walk through a hierarchy of settings and places to look at to ensure you're setting up your coverage correctly. So we're going to talk about master plans and the settings on your master plans. We're going to talk about forecast plans, coverage groups, and item coverage. There's a couple more features that can get tied into this, like your default or site-specific order settings, if you're using things like minimum levels of inventory, minimum order quantities, I should say. But we might not dive into those too in deep, but I will mention them where they are relevant. And then obviously we want to get into AX and show you guys some examples as well. So first off, an introduction. So Volume 2 of the ongoing series, today's topic is coverage. If any of you read the blog before today's webinar, I talked a lot about American football and having to align the right defense to make sure you're preventing the other team from scoring. If you're not a big American football fan or that example is not relevant to you, I thought this map would probably kind of be more relevant for everybody. This is cell phone coverage of a particular plan, and it's telling you, where you are covered and where you aren't. So if you're in Nevada, for example, this wireless provider is not right for you. You can see there's a lot of white space out there where they're just not covered. And you would have to look somewhere else, to somebody else that has good coverage in that area. And it's the same thing with AX. If you're not setting the right parameters, if you're not setting up the right configuration, you could really run into some issues, and your coverage could really fail there. So what we're going to talk about today is what settings you should be applying based on your business scenarios and what options you have. So on the right here, I use an arrow to kind of show you the hierarchy that master planning is looking at when it's coming up with what planned orders are generating. So it's looking at master planning parameters. A little more granular than that is your master plans, because you could have multiple master plans, whereas master planning parameters is one setting, basically. You have your forecast plans, which, once again, you could have multiple forecast plans. Your coverage groups, which is something you can assign to many items, so it's a grouping of basically planning policies for the item of what type or how to group planned orders, or what type of time fences or time buckets are for those planned orders. And then finally, item coverage, which is the most granular level, where you can override certain settings on an item-to-item basis, so more specific item rules for planning, whether it be production, purchasing, or transferring. And then I just put a note here about time fences, positive days, and negative days. We're going to talk a lot about time fences today. Positive days and negative days I'll mention briefly, especially when we get into the client, but that topic is really driven home in depth next week when we have the Reduce the Noise webinar, where you're trying to maximize or even minimize the amount of planned orders you get and the amount of things a planner has to look at on a day-to-day basis. So we're going to talk a lot about next week setting those two fields up to make sure they are correct for your business scenarios. So first off, we have our master plans, and you can see here I have a static plan and a dynamic plan. Your first few settings have to do with what are you including in that master plan? What is that master plan looking at? I already mentioned, do we include on-hand inventory in the master plan? If not, it doesn't matter what's on hand. It's always going to try to net, new supply and new demand together. We also have the ability to say, do we include inventory transactions? So what I mean by that is stuff like inventory journals, movement journals, adjustment journals, transfer journals. Those are receipts and issues. Those are supply and demand. They're either taking inventory out or putting inventory in. So if you have open journals, do you want master planning to recognize that? Because you could run into an example where you have an inventory transaction that says you're about to scrap, let's say 100 pieces of inventory, and that's all of your inventory. If you were not to include that in your master plan and you had a sales order out there that's relying on that inventory, it's just going to, you're basically going to have to look for new supply. Whereas if you had a movement journal bringing inventory in, and that inventory was going to be available once that journal was posted, and you'd want to use that to supply demand, you'd want to recognize that as well so you don't end up bringing in a new purchase order and overstocking. So I would say most companies do inventory transactions, but you don't have to. It's really if you want to make sure that you're netting out the inventory from those inventory transactions. There's quotes, so a lot of companies, especially if they're quoting heavily, might want to include sales quotations as true sources of demand rather than waiting until those are converted to sales orders. And when you enable that field, if this includes sales quotations was set to yes, it enables the field underneath it, which is a probability percentage. So if any of you are using sales quotations, you know that there's a field on the quote of a probability percentage, and that probability is the percentage that you think that quote will turn into a sales order. So if you're including sales quotations, you can set a limit to say, we'll only look at sales quotations that have a probability percentage of turning into orders of 90%. And if so, then make sure we're getting supply to match that demand, because maybe you have long lead times and you can't wait for that order to actually convert. You need to react to it right away. So I wouldn't necessarily say this is commonly used, but it's a feature that's powerful if you're doing a lot of quoting and you have long lead times. You need to make sure you're covering that demand. Obviously, if you do use quotes, you could run into situations where you end up generating supply to match that demand. You bring it in, you end up losing the quote, and now you have extra stock. So be careful, make sure that aligns with your business processes, aligns with any costing that you're trying to achieve, whether it be keeping stocking cost at a minimum or preventing stock out. Make the decision that's best for your company. And then you can also include things like requests for quotations and requisitions, which are obviously on the supply side. The only real time fences we have on the master plans that we're going to review here, we do have more in terms of coverage and things like that. Coverage time fences, freezing time fences, forecast time fences. Typically, companies would rather apply that at the coverage group level because their items are different, rather than set them on the master plan and have that override and be used for everything. So I won't go too into detail on the time fences in the master plans, but there's a few here to point out. You're finding capacity time fences for bottleneck resources, and backward scheduling. So those only come into play if you are using finite capacity, where you're not allowed to overbook resources on a given day, and you're really planning down to the minute rather than just to a generic day in the calendar. Next, we have our forecast plan, so you'll see a lot of the same settings here. Are you including those supply and demand forecasts? So that we're starting to go more towards everything's a demand forecast in newer versions of AX. If any of you are using demand forecasting for R3, or if you're new to and using AX7, and you're really generating demand forecasts even for purchase items, but a supply forecast obviously would be for items that you're purchasing, and a demand forecast in the traditional sense is forecast for demand from sales orders. We have time fences on our forecast plans, so coverage time fence. Time fences are always in days. Here you can see it actually notates that for you. In certain other versions of AX, it just says the time fence, but it always is expressed in days. What a coverage time fence is, it's saying how many days from the current date are we actually covering for? Are we actually having master planning or forecast planning analyze and generating orders against? Anything outside that time fence is ignored. So it does a few things. One, anything that's way out in the future that is well past our lead times that we don't even want to look at, and two, it speeds up your forecast and master planning runs. You don't want to set a coverage time fence that says look out 3 years when your lead times are a month. It wouldn't make much sense. You have your bill of material explosion time fence, so that's your finished good items that have a bill of material. You want it to explode down to the component level, so you want it to trickle down that demand to the components that you need to purchase. A lot of times you'll see the bomb explosion time fence as the same as the coverage. In this case, perhaps the component lead times were a lot shorter and they didn't need to set it quite as high. So once again, one of those things that it's going to be specific to your business processes, your lead times, and the like. And then there's capacity scheduling time fence, which really only comes into play if you are using a finite capacity on your resources and in your master planning calendars. Safety margins are just buffer days. We'll talk about those again next week, but basically they're used internally to offset the actual requirement date. So on the receipt side, if a purchase order is scheduled to come in tomorrow, but we know by the time the warehouse actually gets to receive it, put it away, and it become available, it might be the next day. You can add a buffer day that's really added to the lead time, so it doesn't look like it doesn't show you it's going to be available tomorrow when it's really not. And then we have the same thing on the sales order end, where if we have a sales order that needs to go out August 1st, but we can't actually do the pick, pack, and ship all on August 1st because it's going to take a day, it'll look like that demand is actually needed sooner, so we can make sure we're planning ahead of time and get it to the warehouse to pick, pack, and ship by the actual date it needs to go out. And then a reorder margin is more of like an admin margin, order taking margin, something like that you can add to the item lead time. That one is probably used the least out of the three. Next we have our coverage groups, and I put a big red circle here because the most important thing when it comes to coverage planning in AX is potentially your coverage code. So there's 4 coverage codes in AX. There's min-max, which is shown here. There's requirement-based coverage code, there's period coverage code, and there's manual coverage code. Easiest one we'll start off with is manual. If an item has a coverage group where the coverage code is manual, master planning will basically ignore it. It's not going to plan for it, it's not going to generate planned orders, it shouldn't analyze it. So you'll see that used for items that maybe aren't ready to be running master planning yet, because maybe it's your first foray into planning and you want to trial it with a specific product line. You'll see that used on inventory where it's not sellable inventory. Maybe you have goods you're using around the office supplies, boxes where you do track inventory in the sense that you hold it in stock in AX, but you don't actually need to plan for it. Maybe it's visual type thing, or like an internal outside of the ERP Kanban system where you're kind of manually reordering based on looking at it, or a Kanban type system. So you might set those to manual so AX is not planning them. Once again, could reduce your master planning run, cleans up the messages a little bit because you're not getting planned orders for things you're never going to order anyway. Min-max means we can set a minimum level of inventory for an item and a maximum level of inventory. So when that happens, and master planning reviews are on hand, it reviews our demand and it reviews our supply, and it expects that within the time fence we're going to fall below our minimum level of inventory, it's going to generate planned orders to get us back to a maximum level of inventory. So if you're used to other ERP systems or you're new to AX, I like to say this is kind of the safety stock and reorder point type coverage, where you have both of those levels to make sure you're getting the right planning. a requirement-based coverage code can have a minimum level, but it can't have a maximum level of inventory. So min-max is the only one where you can have the maximum level of inventory. If you're using requirement-based coverage codes, the best way to describe it is it's a one-to-one relation for supply and demand. So if you, let's say you have no on hand, you have no existing purchase orders that are open, you get a sales order for an item. And this is a purchase item rather than a manufactured item. If that sales order comes in for 5 pieces, you get a planned PO to buy 5 pieces to fulfill it. If you get a new sales order for 10 pieces, that gets a new planned order for 10 pieces. So we have the one-to-one relation. Now, there are some settings that can change that, like minimum order quantities, maximum order quantities, and things like that. But in general, that's the best way, I guess, to describe that one. Then we have the period-based coverage group. The big difference there is instead of that one-to-one relation, a period-based coverage group will enable this field of coverage period. Once again in days, and it's days from today. So what a period-based coverage group would mean, let's say this was set to 5 days, it would say, I'm going to look at all demand over that next 5 days, and the 5-day buckets. And instead of generating a planned order to match each one, I'm going to generate one planned order for the sum quantity of all those. So if I had 3 sales orders, one was for 10, one was for 5, and one was for 10 as well, instead of getting 3 planned purchase orders of 10, 10, and 5, we'd get one planned purchase order for 25 pieces because they're in the same bucket, and that's going to minimize freight and shipping costs. It's going to minimize how many planned orders we have to look at. It's just a much more efficient process from a supply chain point of view. So you have those 4 options that you can use for coverage codes, and then in turn those kind of correlate and link to other settings we have in AX, whether those be your minimum order settings or order quantities and your coverage time fences. So the coverage code's the most important thing to understand to start off with. Then we have the time fences on the coverage groups. And like I said, typically companies are going to be specifying them here rather than enabling the ones on the master plans, because you probably have lots of products that are very different, have various lead times, come from different vendors. Your finished goods might be very different than your components, or maybe you just have very, very different product lines. So your time fences are typically going to be set here. First is the coverage time fence. So once again, how many days from today are we planning for? If there's a sales order that's 105 days out, master planning is not going to look at it. It's only going to look at what's in that 100-day time fence. Then we have our negative and positive days. Like I said, we're going to drill into this next week, but at a high level, what this means is positive days, how many days into the future can we use on hand to meet demand rather than generate new planned orders to meet that demand. Negative days is how many days can we have negative coverage for an item before a new planned order is generated. So what I mean by that is maybe we have a sales order set to go August 1st, and we have a planned PO that's coming in July 29th that in terms of quantity could actually fulfill that demand. Or sorry, not July 29th, August 3rd, because it would be a supply that comes in later. So we have a sales order needed to ship August 1st, we have a PO coming in August 3rd, and our negative days is 5 days. Instead of generating a new planned order, since that purchase order that already exists can cover the demand that's 2 days earlier, it's just going to stand pat and say, you know what, you're covered. You might need to expedite that PO to get it in a little bit sooner, but it's not going to generate a new order. Whereas if your negative days was 1 or 0, regardless of the fact that that PO that's coming in later is enough from a quantity standpoint, it's not enough from a date standpoint. So it actually generate a new planned purchase order to bring inventory in so we can meet that sales order demand. So you got to be careful with those, obviously, because you can get messages that say to push stuff out, pull stuff in, and generate a new planned order. So that negative days we'll talk about, like I said, next week, and making sure you set it correctly for what you're trying to achieve. Then we get time fences in the other tab. So we get things like an automatic firming time fence. So if you have items where you really don't need to look at them. They're very static. Maybe it's internal transfers, for example, where you're always just, if you get demand, you're always just going to ship it over to the other warehouse. An automatic firming time fence basically says if the demand date falls within this date range from today, automatically firm it. Don't bother generating a planned order that I have to review, just firm it. So when I say firm it, I mean I don't want a planned purchase order. It's automatically going to create the purchase order. It's basically going to firm it automatically. Planned production order, instead I'd get a production order, and planned transfer order, I would just get the transfer order automatically. So you don't actually have to review those orders if you use automatic firming. Freezing time fence, what it will do is if the requirement date falls within those days, it does a couple things. One, it might not generate a planned order for it, and two, it'll group those dates out into the end of the freezing time fence. It's not something you use too often, or see used too often, but it is available in AX if you need it. And then once again, we have the bill of material explosion time fences and the capacity scheduling time fences that we can apply at the coverage group level as well. And we also have a forecast plan time fence. So sometimes you might not want the time fence that's included in the master plan to look out as far as the entire forecast is. A lot of companies will forecast for a year, but they'll only consider the forecast within the planning part for maybe a few months. So you could put a forecast planning time fence against that coverage group as well. And then we also have safety margins, which we can apply to the coverage groups. If you had safety margins on coverage groups and on master plans, one doesn't trump the other, they're actually added together. So if you're going to use safety margins, you probably want to make a decision on do you apply them to all items or just the coverage group items rather than set them in both places, which could cause some extra buffer days you're really not looking for. And then finally we have item coverage. So item coverage, obviously the most granular of settings, it's at the item level. You can see here they're all the fields from the coverage group, but we could override them. One of the most commonly ways this is used is if I have an item that I stock at multiple warehouses and the default planned order type is purchasing because I purchase it into my main warehouse, which maybe is Site 1 Warehouse 13, but I also stock it in Site 1 Warehouse 15. And Warehouse 15 would never buy it. They would always get it from Warehouse 13. I would set up item coverage for Warehouse 15, and I would change this default planned order type from production to transfer order, and I would say transfer it from Warehouse 13. So instead of getting purchase or production notices in both warehouses, the main warehouse gets the default planned order type notice, and this warehouse would always be transferred via the other warehouse. And then like you can see, you can override coverage group settings for certain time fences or the specific coverage code for that warehouse if for some reason it's different. And you have settings for your min-max levels as well. One of the things I thought about recently is we'll probably do a session just on minimum level of inventory or safety stock, walk through that calculation and what options you have in terms of fulfilling minimums. Whether it be using this field to say when do we actually generate planned orders to fulfill the minimum buy, or whether it's using things like min-max keys for controlling seasonality. So we will probably have a future webinar just on safety stock. We're about to go into AX and demonstrate some of this, walk through some of this more specifically and do some examples. So with that, I'll just see what questions we have. Are the time fences in working days or calendar days? So typically they're going to be in working days, but if your calendars themselves are set up on the coverage group, then it will look at the calendar. So a lot of companies will assign the calendar onto the coverage group. There's a field there. So it should look at calendar days, but if you're not using specific calendars, it might look at working days. And if I didn't answer your question, just send a follow-up note and I'll come back to it. When min-max is applied, does it mean that master planning will ensure the accumulated stock changes only between minimum level and maximum level? Yeah, so what the min-max tries to do is it says once you fall below that min, I will only generate enough planned orders to get you back to the max unless there is so much demand that we're going to go well beyond that max. So it will never necessarily stop you from matching the demand. If the demand's there, you're going to get planned orders to try to supply it. But if all it did was you fell below the minimum and there's no due demand, it's just going to say get back to that maximum level of inventory and stop there. Does that answer your question, Yajing? Okay, we can follow up afterwards on that and dive in if we need to. So with that, I'm going to dive into AX, and just as a reminder to everybody, we're going to be showing all of this in the new Microsoft Dynamics AX or AX7. But once again, most of the things we're going to be walking through still apply to AX 2012. AX 2009, some cases AX 4.0. Obviously, there were some limitations in earlier versions. Sites did not become available until AX 2009 and things like that. So just need to be wary of what version you're on. But most of the principles we talk about will apply to all the versions of AX. Yes, there is a recording for the webinars that we do here. We're going to be posting them on the eBECS website, so the same way you registered for this webinar, if you go to the events page on the eBECS site, once the recording is posted, it will basically allow you to download the recording of this. So I can show you that at the end, but it will be available via the ebecs.com website under the events page. So once again, we're starting here at the workspace feature of AX. You have your work tiles, and you can get into the most commonly used areas of AX. So if I were to use master planning, for example, it goes right into my planned orders. But today I want to start at our settings, so we'll have to use the navigation bar to the left to actually go over to the master planning module. So this is kind of the day-to-day activities through the work panes or the workspaces. And your module access to get to all your normal screens will be from the left side navigation bar. So if we look quickly at master planning parameters, you can see we've specified our default plans. We have a general coverage group. So a general coverage group is used where if you have items that you're not going to go through 10,000 items and assign a coverage group if only 10% of your items are being planned. So a general coverage group is used if the coverage group is not assigned to the item. So if that field is not specified on the item, it uses whatever is here in the master planning parameters. Talked about negative days. Like I said, we're going to go into that in detail next week, but this checkbox here is very important if you are setting negative days. So we will review that next week. If you are using negative days and you have this set to no, that could be one issue why you might run into some odd planned order scenarios and date scenarios. Safety margins. When we use safety margins, this is the one time fence that's a little bit different, where it says, are you using working days or calendar days? And then we have today's date calendar. So typically it's going to be using these calendar days for all of our time fences. Planned orders. We talked about capacity planning, not specific to coverage, but if you are using capacity planning, you have some settings here. You have settings on the resources, and you have settings in the coverage groups that affect that. So those are important to know if you're not using capacity planning, which when a lot of companies start out using master planning in AX, they don't, because it can be quite restrictive. Make sure that any fields where you see the capacity planning are either turned off or the time fences for them are 0 until you ensure you're ready to actually use capacity planning and scheduling in AX. So that's the high-level setting is the parameters, and then we go into our plans. So everything I showed in those screenshots would be in your master plans. Once again, in my demo environment, I have a single static and dynamic plan. I'm including on-hand inventory, I'm including inventory transactions, I'm not including sales quotations, and I can access all my time fences. So what you'll see here, what I mentioned in the PowerPoint is all of these are set to no. Once again, because I don't want every item to have the same group of settings. I'm going to decide those time fences on a grouping level that's specific to my items, because my finished goods, my components, my different product lines all have different lead times, and I don't want to group them under one large bucket. Calculated delays are what used to be called futures messages. So if you see that while we go through these demos, that's what a calculated delay is. The futures message was kind of a misleading label for what we used in futures messages. And once again, a future message is it's based on the on-hand and supply that we have. It's the realistic date AX thinks we can ship a sales order by or complete a production order by. So it's saying that, you know, if we have a bunch of components that aren't going to be available by the requirement date, it's going to say, well, you should really push that production order out because you're not going to have inventory available to actually make that item. Or same thing with a sales order. If there's a sales order set to ship tomorrow and we don't have inventory, you might get a calculated delay that says you should really update that sales order date and talk to your customer, because based on our supply, we're just not going to be able to ship by that date. And then once again, our action messages, which are suggestions of adding, subtracting inventory from, or quantities from transactions, or pushing out days, and expediting days, and our safety margins. So once again, we're going through that hierarchy of settings. Master planning parameters, most high level. Master and forecast plans, a little more granular. We've already gone through these settings. And then our coverage groups, even more granular than that, apply these to a group of items rather than all items. So we saw in the PowerPoint our coverage code. You can see I have a min-max one, a period-based coverage code with 7 days. So any demand with requirement dates within the same 7-day bucket would be grouped together to one planned order, rather than get planned orders for each demand order, each sales order. We have our coverage time fence, negative and positive days, and then all our other time fences. So our coverage time fences, automatic firm-in and freeze, action messages if we're using them, and delay messages if we're using them as well. We also have a requirement-based coverage group set up, and another requirement-based coverage group with just different lead times. So we have a bunch of different examples there that we can walk through when we actually look at net requirements for a specific item that we'll get to in a minute. Looks like we have a question. We've set up multiple coverage groups. Would you recommend having less? Tough question to answer. It really depends. I would rarely ever see a company only has one. Most of my clients probably have, no more than 10, but I've seen companies with a lot more. It depends on, your product lines, your lead times. If you have very, very different lead times, let's say you had 20 different product lines that are so vastly different, you might really have to use more coverage groups. If you're only dealing with one type of product, the lead times are all very similar, the planning is fairly similar, you can get away with a lot less. But I've dealt with organizations that had 10, 20,000 items and only needed maybe 10 coverage groups. So it's pretty business specific. Without knowing your organization, that's tough to answer, but hopefully some of the things we look at today, you can kind of get a better idea of what works for you. And if not, you can always shoot me some questions afterwards. So that's the coverage groups, and then the last one I'd like to show you is the item coverage, and then we'll actually look at an example of changing some of these settings on an item and actually how it affects what you do on a day-to-day basis. So I have set up an item for today's demo. We'll look for it in the release products. Looks like my filter didn't work there. There we go. Luckily, it was one of the first ones that came up. So under your plan tab, and this is in the same place no matter which version of AX you're using, is your item coverage. As you can see here, I'm planning right now for this item at Site 2, Warehouse 21, and I have a requirement-based coverage group. So if I get new demand and I don't have on hand or any existing supply, it's going to generate a new planned order to match that demand. I also have a minimum level of inventory of 100 pieces. So if AX sees that I'm going to fall below 100 pieces of inventory, it's going to generate orders to try to get me to maintain that level of inventory. As you can see, I can't define a maximum because my coverage group isn't period. I will change this in a minute to show you what the difference is really if I have a different type of coverage group on my planned orders and my messages and things like that. So my planned order type, my default planned order type is purchase order. Where this is coming from is actually, I'll just go back one screen. Let me move the meeting notice here. We'll go back one screen. It's coming from your default order settings and the default order type. So like I said, you can have one default order type for an item, so this was purchased, but if I have other warehouses or other sites that also use this item and they're getting it via transfer order, that would be overridden in the item coverage. So for example, I'd go back to my item coverage setup. Let's say we also use this in a different warehouse at Site 2. I could add a new line. Let's say it's used in, I don't know if this will work, because I don't think I set this item up for advanced warehouse management, but we'll give it a try. Say I also use it in Warehouse 24, but I would never purchase it there. It's easier for me to transfer from Warehouse 21. I would change my planned order type to transfer, and I would say, where am I transferring from? And in this case, it would be Warehouse 21. So whenever there's demand on Warehouse 24 and Warehouse 24 doesn't have inventory to cover it, it's going to generate a planned transfer order to pull that inventory from Warehouse 21. From a requirement standpoint or a planned order standpoint, what does this look like? I'll give it a minimum so we have some demand in both warehouses so you guys can see what that would look like. So right now we have a minimum of 100 and a minimum of 5. And we're going to go in and we're going to see what that would look like if master planning were to run. So we're going to update our master plan just to make sure it's reading the most up-to-date information, because once again I'm in my static plan, not my dynamic plan, so there would be no planned orders against that new demand yet since I just changed those settings. So now we have, looks like I must have some sales orders out there without a warehouse, which I'll have to clean up. But if we look at Warehouse 21, I don't have any on-hand inventory. I have a minimum of 100, and I have a transfer requirement to fulfill Warehouse 24. So I'm getting 2 planned purchase orders. Reason for that is because it's a requirement-based coverage group. So regardless of the fact that this inventory is needed on the same day, because I did the requirement-based coverage group, it's generating 1 planned purchase order for 100 pieces to match my minimum, and 1 planned purchase order of 5 pieces to fulfill that transfer requirement. And you can use things like your pegging to review that. So I don't know if my screen will be big enough here. Here we go. So if I look at my pegging, it says this planned order of 5 is to match that transfer requirement, and this planned purchase order for 100 is to match my safety stock. And then if I were to look at Warehouse 24, all I have is the planned transfer receipt of 5 because I have a safety stock of 5 in that warehouse. So that's what it would look like if your coverage code was requirement-based. And before I change that to period-based and rerun and show you, I'll just make sure we don't have any questions. Can I apply more than 1 calendar on the same coverage group? No. There's only 1 field on the 1 coverage group to give it a calendar. So the coverage group to calendar is a 1-to-1 relation. So this is kind of a simple scenario, like I said here, 1-to-1 relation in terms of planned orders or supply to match demand. Now, if we were to edit this item coverage and give it a new coverage group, I could change that default on the item up. From here, I'm going to show you how to change it for a specific item coverage. typically, your actual coverage group you would set on the item, and I'll show you where that is in a minute. For now, I'm just going to change it from here. So I'm going to change my coverage group. I believe the period-based one was this one. If not, we can always double check. Yeah, so period-based. So, this name of group in my demo environment might not be the best in terms of remembering what settings actually apply to that. Typically, you try to give some sort of smart name to it so you actually remember what that coverage group stands for. I would have called it period 5 or something like that probably. So I changed my coverage group setting for Warehouse 21 to say I want to group requirements over a specific period rather than get one planned purchase order for each one. So now I'm going to go back into my net requirements, and I'm going to update master planning since we just made that change. And you can see now instead of 2 planned orders, one of 100 and one of 5, I have a single planned order. They're needed on the same date. There's no point in me placing 2 POs on the vendor, which means more conversations with them, more POs to deal with, more invoices to deal with, etc. I'm just going to place the 1 PO, get all 105 at once, save on shipping and freight costs, and deal with it that way. So that's what a period-based coverage group allows you to do, is group that demand over the same time bucket into one planned order. If we were to set a manual coverage group, it won't plan for the item. So once again, I'll just do this via the override. Don't think we had one. We had a raw material 5-day lead time, and we had an auto. Not sure if they had a manual one set up. Doesn't look like we do. So I'll just create a new one very quickly, kind of show you guys what this would look like. I'll leave the default settings as they are. We don't really need to mess around with the time fences on a manual coverage group. But if I were to change this setting now to manual, and then once again we're going to go to net requirements and update master planning for this item. We can see that I have a transfer requirement, but that's all it's showing me. It's not actually generating the planned order to meet that minimum, because I'm saying I'm manually planning this item. Any orders I need to place, I'm going to run a report or something and make those decisions manually rather than have it generate planned orders to meet that demand. So I can see that I have a transfer requirement, but and I can see that there's a minimum level of inventory on it, but it's never going to actually analyze that and generate a planned order for me to review. It's going to expect that I'm doing any buying or production manually. So I did mention that your coverage group itself is set up on the item. So in the release product details, that would be in your plan tab. So you can see here mine's blank, which is why requirement came up originally as the coverage group when I set up my initial item coverage, because that was, once again, the default coverage group in my master planning parameters. So if we didn't want to use the default on this item, we typically set the coverage group here, and then if it's different per storage dimension coverage planning, like it's different in another warehouse, you would override it in the item coverage. But you do set the default for the item in the plan tab of the release product details. Looks like we have another question. If a part's set to manual on a live PO, it will say cancel PO. Is there a way of stopping this? Probably have to, you'd have to turn off action messages for that coverage group. So if you don't want to get messages to cancel or edit existing orders, you want to turn off your actions. Sometimes companies, I'll show you what that looks like. Sometimes companies, when they're getting started in AX, the actions and futures can be very cumbersome to review. you've got to understand them very well. So a lot of companies, what they'll do is, if we go back to our master planning coverage groups, what they would do in a situation like that is you'd come into your action messages and you'd either turn them off completely, or you could turn off specific ones. So you could say anything in terms of quantity, which would be decrease and increase quantity. A cancellation message would be a decrease in quantity. You might want to turn those off. And then the advance and postpone are dates. So if you ever get messages that tell you to advance or postpone dates, and that's not something your company uses, those suggestions or those buy notices or make notices, you can turn those individual ones off as well. So like I said, if you have a manual coverage group and you don't want a cancellation message, I would probably just turn off all actions for that coverage group. So those are kind of all the settings you would have. If we go quickly over our planned orders, obviously I kind of worked out of the net requirements there to show you guys examples, but where this is going to have the effect on a day-to-day basis is what type of planned orders are being generated, how many you're going to get. If you have requirement-based coverage code, you're going to have more planned orders. If you had a period-based coverage code, you're going to have less, and those are going to drive also what quantities. The one thing I didn't show, obviously, that does also factor in is your default site-specific order settings. So if we look at this number, for example, this D0006, and we were to look at some of the plan settings, I think I can get to them from here. Still trying to get used to some of the new features in AX7. Looks like that's just going to take me straight to my item coverage. So what we'll do is we'll actually just go back to the item we were using under release products. Our default site-specific order settings is where we can put in, for purchasing, purchase quantities and multiples, min and max order quantities. So if you will always buy 100 of something because that's how the vendor supplies it, they'll never ship you less than 100. If it's just more efficient or cost effective to do that, your minimum order quantities would make sure that you're always purchasing in 100. So if I had set a minimum order quantity of 100 on this item and I get demand for 5 pieces and I have nothing on hand and no POs, it's going to generate a planned PO purchase order for 100 pieces, even though I only need 5, because I'm saying I'll never order less than 100. Now, you have a warning. You'll get a warning if you try to edit that, so you can actually get around it. But from a pure planning perspective, it would generate a planned PO for 100 pieces if I were to set a minimum order quantity there. And then a maximum order quantity obviously would prevent it from ever planning something more than a certain amount. And then you have standard order quantities and multiple as well. Inventory would be the same fields, but this would be more for like the production and transfer order side of things rather than purchase orders. And then you also have those same settings for sales orders to make sure you have min, max, or standard order quantities for your customers on sales orders. So these will tie in with the coverage settings as well, but if you're not using those, the most important things are going to come from your coverage group and your item coverage. So with that, I'll quickly open it up for more questions before we close out. Looks like we got one. Find that if we set a minimum order quantity and place that minimum once the order is placed, MRP will suggest to reduce quantity. Is there a way around this? Once again, that really comes into play with your action messages. That is something a lot of customers have a difficult time with, because typically if you're using minimum order quantities, you probably don't want, maybe you don't want action messages because they are gonna say that. They're gonna say reduce to what your actual demand is. They are just suggestions, so obviously it's not forcing you to do anything, but it is a little bit of clutter. So if you wanted to avoid those, you would have to either turn off or reduce the amount of time you have action messages. Otherwise, those those are going to continue to pop up. So there's not really a great way around that unless you just stop using the messages. What I'll do, just in case, I'm going to unmute everybody really quickly. Okay, so we can create a coverage group that deals with products that are MOQ items. Yes, you could, absolutely. No reason you couldn't do that. A lot of my clients do that. I'm going to unmute everybody really quick in case there's some questions there that people want to ask. You can mute yourself if you want. I think there's an easy way for me to unmute everybody. Like I said, mute yourself if you don't want any background noise to be caught in, but I just want to double check there's not any more questions out there. Looks like it's going to not let me unmute all, maybe. Okay. Are there any other questions before we close out here? Just feel free to type them in the screen here. Okay, I will show a slide in a minute that gives you the contact information if you think of questions or didn't get a chance to ask your questions today. We can make sure we get back to you on whatever you guys have left. So upcoming webinars, make sure to go to ebecs.com/events. It will show you all our upcoming webinars, including those of this master planning series. Right now, we only have one scheduled so far for this series, which is next Wednesday, August 3rd. It's the Reduce the Noise webinar, heavy on time fences, positive and negative days, actions, and delays. So I urge you, of those who had similar questions about turning off some of those suggestions to cancel, to attend that one, and hopefully we can get some more scheduled soon. I just got to think of which topics we want to cover, so feel free to reach out to us if you have specific topics around planning. We're going to do one on, like I said, safety stock, minimum levels of inventory, most likely. We're going to do one on capacity scheduling. We just kind of got to get those scheduled and written out. We like to do the blogs first as an introduction to the topic. Also next Wednesday we have a Power BI webinar, BI Accelerator. Most likely will be given by our BI lead, Jeremy Kingery, but I'm not 100% positive on that, so don't hold me to it. We do have a field service webinar on August 10th, and we do have a V7 series webinar on Sarbanes-Oxley Improved Tools for Compliance. So make sure you guys look for those. Very, very useful information and great introduction into the newest version of AX. eBECS, we provide AX audit service, proof of concepts. So for a flat fee, a lot of times we'll do a proof of concept of designing an AX implementation for you so you can decide whether or not you would want to go forward with an AX design or a future release of AX based on a requirements analysis we do. We do upgrade assessments, or if you're on AX 4.0, 2009, 2012, and looking to upgrade to a later version, we do those as well as cloud-ready assessments. So if you're looking at private or public cloud with Azure, especially with AX 7, we provide those types of assessments. And then finally, this is a little more on the upgrade assessments. It's a flat fee of $2,500 or £2,500, and it's a 2-day on-site assessment, really trying to understand the ROI for cloud versus on-premise, looking at your requirements closely, talking through with our consultants about what your needs are, and working through things like BI, lifecycle services, and getting a high-level project plan. I will review the questions that are there. I do see them. Just wanted to put this up here for any contact information. If you guys have follow-up questions, you want to talk to us about projects you're doing, or bring us in for any of those events we mentioned, you can contact Charlotte McCormick, cmccormick@ebecs.com for U.S. and North America, and swilson@ebecs.com if you're in the UK or Europe.